Great. Thank you all for joining us today. This is, I mean, we're meeting essentially in the middle of a network usage fee storm globally, where after a bit of a lull, it seems to have popped up in different parts of the world. South Korea was the first to, I guess, where the idea of network usage fees started being talked about. We've got the stuff happening in Brazil, Europe. There are things happening uh, from what we believe following a statement from the European Parliament. There's also a bit of confusion across, um, at least in terms of what we're seeing in terms of submissions in India, where we feel that there's not much clarity on what's happening globally. As we've seen responses to this consultation come in, we've seen the telecom operators in India refer to the situation in the European Union and South Korea fairly frequently to point at the two and say that they've implemented network usage fees and argue that the concept is now getting global acceptance. Um, and these responses explain how the European Parliament has called for the establishment of a policy framework where large traffic generators should contribute to adequate funding of telecom networks. And in the South Korean context, some responsive have asserted that there is a law in the country that says network usage fees should be are being imposed on online companies with 1 million users per day and more than 1% of South Korea's internet traffic. We had briefly discussed South Korea's situation with Professor Park, who's also joining us as a panelist today. And actually, it was his statement that there might be a misinterpretation or a mistranslation of the Telecommunications Business Act, which forced us to explore what's happening globally, because one expected there to be, some sort of fidelity in submissions and some sort of truthfulness in submissions. So we went down a rabbit hole of trying to understand what's happening internationally. And for that, we are very pleased to have a panel of speakers who are experts in issues of network usage fees and net neutrality and have experiences not just in South Korea and Europe, but in these issues across the globe. I'm very pleased to have Barbara Vanchevik, who's previously testified before the TRAI and the EU's telecom regulator BEREC on this issue, and she's up at an unearthly hour from San Francisco joining us here in India. We've got Carl Ganberg. He's the Director of Policy Development and Research at the Internet Society. Alyssa Starzak, the Global Head of Public Policy at Outplay. Thomas Vollmer, the Head of Global Content Delivery Policy at Netflix. And Professor K.S. Park, the co-founder of OpenNet Korea. So we'll have an initial round of comments, particularly from Barbara and Carl about the global situation, and then we'll open it up for questions that I have for each of you. And then we'll open it up for questions for everyone who's attending. Just to remind you, this is being live streamed on YouTube as well and on MediaNama. And, we will also be writing about this at MediaNama going forward. We have invited the regulator in India to join us for this. And of course, Kamya and I today morning were at an ITU discussion on the same issue. And there's a focus group meeting in India over the next couple of days. So our timing couldn't have been better. Carl, I'll start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening in Europe? Where do we stand? What has led to this discussion in Europe, and how does ISOC view all the developments that are taking place globally?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation to this panel. I really appreciate that this topic is being discussed in as many forums as possible, because this is really a priority topic for us at the Internet Society, because we're deeply concerned about this evolution or this development of fair share or center party pays or network usage fees, the different namings for a similar phenomena. And I think we'll get into the details about the differences today. But what's happening in Europe now is basically that for about a year, you've had a discussion in Europe that has been inspired by some of the developments that have happened in South Korea. And this is a debate that was initiated by the large telecom operators in Europe around the beginning of last year. And they are pitching this idea of imposing network usage fees. And the concept of network usage fee is something that they've sort of imported from discussions in South Korea. But where we're at in Europe right now is that we've recently had a consultation on this topic initiated by the European Commission. And we're currently awaiting the responses from this consultation here in Europe. But that's the state of the debate, really. It's been a discussion in policy circles in Europe and in Brussels. The Commission has had a consultation in which some of the questions in that consultations referred to this question around network usage fees. And we're still waiting response for that. But that's basically where we're at right now. So there hasn't been an initiation of a legislative process or anything similar, but rather it is a debate among stakeholders in Europe. And from our point of view, we're very concerned about this topic, both for the reasons of violations of net neutrality, which I think we'll discuss today, but also because we see a high risk of internet fragmentation coming from these types of rules. I'll be happy to elaborate more on that later.
So how did we get to this point that there's a discussion on network usage fees, particularly in Europe?
Yeah, so if we kind of contrast it a little bit with the discussions in South Korea, I think that could be helpful to just kind of set the mind frame here. So the rules that are in force in South Korea and what is being discussed in Europe, they're quite similar, but they're also somewhat different. And the similarity basically comes down to this idea of regulating internet traffic according to a principle of sender pays. But the rules that are in force in South Korea, they're also slightly different because right now the obligations are targeted towards internet service providers, while what's being proposed in Europe is that the rules would target content providers. So they're slightly different in terms of their target, but the effects are more or less similar. But they're also related because what happened in South Korea is that they started with these sender pays rules targeting internet service providers. There were some adverse effects from this in terms of how costs were effectively imposed on domestic provider versus foreign providers. So as a kind of a way of an attempt of sort of leveling this playing field, there's currently a legislative proposal in South Korea around network usage fees, which goes beyond just regulating the interconnections and is more of a classical kind of termination fee that you would have in the telephone system where the content provider would need to pay the access network for the access network to deliver its data. So that's kind of where the inspiration for this discussion in Europe come from, where they saw the developments in South Korea, they saw the legislative discussions around network usage fees, and saw that that was something that could also be discussed in Europe. And the rationale in the European context that the telcos are promoting is that they're arguing that there is an investment gap to meet the targets of deploying high-speed connectivity infrastructure by 2030. And the argument from their side is that we're not able to meet these targets, and in part because of a high growth of traffic and increasing costs of their networks, and therefore a mechanism like this would be warranted. So that's a bit of background to how this sort of was inspired from South Korea and then has moved into the European discussion.
Barbara, one of the things that we're hearing in India and seeing in Indian submissions in the European Parliament has voted in favor of network usage fees. And to that extent, Europe's already taken a decision. Can you tell us if that's the case and what, or if not, what is this? What's going on in Europe right now?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I apologize for not being on camera right now. My computer just crashed. And so I'll talk through my iPad until I'm back with my full computer. So the idea that the European Parliament voted in favor of network fees is false. I want to take a step back by saying, as Carl said, this is a proposal that has been rejected over and over. For years, the large telecom companies have tried to get paid twice from their users. So first from the users that pay them to get access to the internet, and then a second time from the sites and apps that the telecoms users want to visit. And, part of what's so ironic for everyone who has worked on this for a long time is that this proposal has been rejected over and over in the past 15 years. And this time around is no different. So it was first discussed in 2012 when the largest European telecom companies represented by their trade association, ETNO, wanted the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, to adopt this proposal. At the time, everybody was looking into it. The OECD rejected it. Most of the member states in the European Union as such, the United States rejected it. And in the end, it was rejected by the ITU. It didn't become law. And since then, every couple of years, the phone and cable companies have come back and said, hey, we should really get paid by the phone and cable companies that by the content providers that our users want to visit. And so in the US, in Europe, the latest version of this debate was kicked off by a large letter and then a report by ETNO, which is, the trade association that represents Europe's largest telecom companies, the Deutsche Telekom, Telefonica, Orange, so the incumbents, the former monopolists. And Commissioner Breton, who is the commissioner in charge of regulating telecom services, came out really quickly and aggressively siding with them. Might be worth noting in this context that Commissioner Breton was the CEO of Orange, so the former state monopolist in France before. And since he originally endorsed this proposal in May 2022, everyone else in Europe has come out against this proposal. So it started with Europe's top telecom regulator, BEREC, who in the fall of 2022, after investigating this issue properly, with a whole bunch of workshops with academics, civil society representatives, and industry participants, said, we looked into this again and nothing has changed since 2012. There is no market failure that needs solving. There is no problem that needs solving. And to the contrary, adopting this proposal would be harmful for the internet ecosystem, would harm innovation and competition. And since then, basically everyone has come out against the proposal. 18 of the 27 member states in the European Union are opposed to that proposal. Lots of, companies and stakeholders, basically everyone other than the telcos and the companies and the academics that are paid by them, are against this proposal. So you asked specifically about what the European Parliament has done here. And what you describe is a huge misinformation campaign. Because first, the European Parliament did not adopt any binding recommendation. What we are talking about is one paragraph in a 25-page report on a totally different topic. So this was the 2022 annual report on competition policy by the Parliament's Committee on Economic and Monetary Affairs. So this is not a law, this is not a regulation, it's just sort of a statement about what happened in competition policy. And at the last minute, allies of the large telecom companies put in this paragraph that could be read to endorse network fees. There was a huge fight, and in the end, the Parliament affirmatively voted to reject network fees. And here's why. So if they did not pass this paragraph as it was, they added a couple of words that totally changed the meaning. So they added, we think companies should participate and there should be sort of a fair distribution of the costs, but without violating net neutrality. And that's really the key language in this proposal. Both BEREC and so the top telecom regulator, who is the expert on the Europe's net neutrality law, and lots of other stakeholders, including me, have explained how these network fees would violate Europe's net neutrality law. And I know from talking to the people who negotiated this amendment that they knew that network fees violate net neutrality and that they deliberately added this language to the paragraph in order to make clear that the network usage fees that the telcos want to have should not be pursued. And so unfortunately, this kind of nuance has been lost on the press, for example, so that, even some of the press reports that came out right after the vote made it seem as if the parliament had endorsed network fees, but it did not. And in essence, intentionally voted to reject network fees.
So I have a statement here that, in fact, we just got from the from COAI, which is kind of like India's ECNO. They've said that fair share does not affect access to an open and free internet. The content and services for consumers will remain fully accessible with no traffic management or differentiation. There will be no throttling, no blocking, no paid prioritization for any service, irrespective of the fair share charge paid. The price for traffic paid by end users will not change depending on whether the traffic generator is subject to fair share payments or not. And so they're saying that contrary to misguided opinions being floated in various fora, a fair share contribution from OTTs will not violate net neutrality. How would you respond to this?
Yeah, we hear that over and over. And what we are seeing here is basically the disinformation playbook. Just repeat your argument so many times without really engaging with the other side's argument. So both in India and in Europe, network fees would clearly violate net neutrality. And the arguments we just heard basically miss the point. So what the network fees want is to charge some companies, the companies that offer services that are so popular that many people use them at the same time. And they are supposed to pay network fees and other companies do not. So that treats companies that are supposed to pay network fees differently from those that don't. That's an economic discrimination. And treating some companies differently from others is a key net neutrality issue. It distorts competition among application and content providers, and that's what we want to avoid. So I say this is ironic because both in India and in Europe, we have very clear statements that make clear that this kind of economic discrimination, charging some companies but not others, is squarely covered by the net neutrality protections. In Europe, we know this from the decisions by the European Court of Justice in 2021 and 2020 that said very clearly, well, guys, in the past, you thought that only technical discrimination violates net neutrality. So if I speed up some applications and slow down others, or I block some applications, I have paid fast lanes, that kind of technical differential treatment violates net neutrality. But the European Court of Justice said, that would be too narrow to only think that those kinds of discrimination are a problem, because ultimately economic and technical discrimination are just two sides of the same coin. I can harm you by making your application slower, and I can harm you by charging you a fee. And that's exactly what the zero rating plans that the European Court of Justice was looking at was doing. So the key idea here is that network fees are economic discrimination, and they violate Europe's non-discrimination rule. So basically what the ISPs are trying to do, and the statement that you just read is a great example of that, are trying to confuse everyone by saying, we are not talking about technical discrimination. We want to, transport every packet in the same way. And the only thing that is different, some companies pay and some don't. But that's the wrong aspect to look at, because the economic discrimination as such violates net neutrality. And interestingly, it's the same in India. You all know that, India was one of the leaders in the world in recognizing that not counting some traffic against data caps and then having everything else eat up your data, this practice that we call zero rating, that's a net neutrality violation. That was TRAI in its 2016 order on differentiated pricing practices. And so in India too, we don't have to speculate whether charging some companies and not others engaging in economic discrimination is a net neutrality violation. TRAI has already found that. And so it doesn't matter whether there is also blocking or throttling or pay prioritization.
Thanks, Barbara. Professor Park, thank you for speaking with MediaNama earlier. I was just wondering about how the sender party network-based system operates in South Korea. And can you walk us through what happened with Facebook and its impact on SPNP?
Sure. In answering your question, I'll add a little bit on Barbara's answer to the question, to your previous question. I'll go even further than that. Like charging companies differently will also violate net neutrality, but charging any company any money for propagating data, I think violates net neutrality, because if prioritization of a data delivery is conditioned on payment, then performing data delivery, conditioning data delivery itself on payment also constitute financial discrimination, because unless you don't, if you don't pay, the data doesn't move forward, and that is the sender pay. So sender pay fundamentally violates net neutrality, because net neutrality requires all the network participants to deliver data packets from their neighbors, from their immediate neighbors, to their next immediate neighbors, without any charge or without any condition. And that condition cannot be financial, cannot be legal, cannot be content-based. And if any of the network participants start charging for data delivery, then other network participants will start charging, and it will break down this this great crowdsourcing mechanism that internet has, where all the network participants kind of share with all other network participants all their connections, all their network resources, so that you don't charge one another for data delivery. You charge, you only pay money. You are only responsible for maintaining connection. That's what you pay at home to get internet access. That's what that's what content providers pay under the name of transit to ISPs. So sender pay model basically is exactly that. You are already familiar with a couple of sender pay models. When you send ordinary mail, in an envelope, what do? You put a stamp on it, right? So as a sender, you have to pay. When you make a phone call, what do? You pay telecom companies, right? So whoever is pushing the data on the network, quote unquote, burdening the network, has to pay somebody to have the network, deliver the data. That's the sender pay model, and we call the termination charge because we are asking the network to terminate, meaning deliver to the end that data. So termination fee is actually a delivery charge. Now, as I said, the internet, made possible this information revolution only by getting rid of the transaction cost of charging one another for data delivery. If charging for data delivery takes place, again, it will generate a tremendous transaction cost that will just break down the internet. Anyway, to talk about Korea, so the sender pay model was instituted only among the ISPs. So let me share something here. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, we can see the slide.
All right, we can see the slide. Okay. For some reason, I cannot see the slide. Let me see. Okay, here we go. So there are three networks, ISP1, ISP2, ISP3, right? Now, let's assume that, just assume that ISP1 is a KT, and Facebook had their cache server on ISP1's network, and because Facebook was popular. By the way, okay, all right. Let me start with the rule. So sender pay rule was applied only among ISPs. Previously, ISP1, ISP2, ISP3, as they send data to one another, they didn't have to pay. They didn't have to pay each other. But in 2016, they changed the rule so that whoever is sending more data to the other ISP should pay the receiving ISP. So you see Facebook cache server is on ISP1's network, and you see the computers on ISP2's network and computers and ISP3's network. When those computers, when people using those computers want to use Facebook data, they'll have to ping, they'll have to send a request to Facebook, but that request has a really small data. It's just a ping. And Facebook cache server responds by sending a lot of data through ISP1 and then to ISP2 and ISP3. And that means that ISP1 has to start paying money to ISP2 and ISP3, right? So that means now Facebook is now becoming a burden to ISP1 for being popular to all the computers within Korea, right? So when there's a negotiation between content provider and ISP1, now ISPs have a reason to charge more money, right? But I'll get to that later. Since you asked about Facebook controversy first. So anyway, Facebook, because of the Facebook cache server ISP1, KT had to pay a lot of money to other ISP2, other ISPs like SKT and LG. So KT demanded payment, demanded compensation from Facebook for hosting their cache server. But for a very good reason, they have Facebook was hosted by ISP1 for free because of this reason. Okay. All right. I shared another.
Okay, we can see this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, sorry. So this is the, let's assume that this is the entire architecture of the network. So at the top, you have a tier 1, the higher ISP that has the, better visibility, best visibility over all the computers. And then below there is a, intermediate tier ISP. And then below that, there is an individual ISP. And look at the user at the bottom here. If a user, and on the right side, there's a Facebook main server that's in the US. And if the user tries to use data on Facebook's main server, imagine how many hops it has to go through from Facebook main server. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? If you followed my prompt, right? But if there's a cache server, then user can get it like right there, right? Now, this is good for both the user and Facebook because there is a less number of hops that the data has to make. But also, this is good for the Korean ISP that's hosting Facebook because each ISP, each lower level ISP have to pay higher ISP for internet connection themselves. Because when they sell internet access, they sell full connectivity. Like you never sell like Korean internet, right? You sell the internet, meaning the ability to connect with all the computers around the world. Right. So to give money's worth, to provide the service worth the money, KT and the local ISPs have to maintain connection with a higher tier ISP. So in order to do that, they pay their own internet access fees. But now, if the data comes directly from cache server instead of a main server, the local ISP don't have to pay that transit to a higher ISP. So because of that, the KT, let's go back to this diagram. KT, when KT demanded payment from Facebook, Facebook said, hey, you welcomed us, you allowed us to, you hosted us for free for all benefit. Now you are asking for money, we don't want to pay, right? We don't want to pay. But KT began threatening to, I think it made a veritable threat. So it became a chicken. It became a chicken game. KT saying, "Oh, unless you pay, I'll cut the connection." Facebook was saying, "Oh, you'll never cut connection because there are so many KT users in Facebook, right?" And because Facebook's cache server was only in KT network, actually all Korean users will stop using Facebook. So in the end, Facebook just decided that, okay, well, if you don't pay, if you keep demanding money, we're not gonna use Facebook cache server. We're not gonna use Facebook cache server with respect to okay, well, to simplify, they just said, we're not gonna use cache server to deliver data to Korea. We'll just follow the normal route or the pre-existing route going through the high LTL ISP. So there was a demand. So now the data came through the intermediate ISPs, causing a lot of latency on the data. So that's when the Korean government intervened and tried to sanction Facebook for changing the route to make the user experience, Facebook user experience, more latency ridden. But that was overruled by the court. So that's what happened. And on top of that,
so what you're saying, Professor Park, is that the sender party network-based model meddled with the existing relationship between caching and ISPs, forcing Facebook to choose a mechanism which has higher latency and less efficiency.
Yeah.
So that model actually disincentivized a more efficient method of internet delivery.
Sure. And that's what happened in terms of overseas providers, overseas content providers. But let's look at this diagram again. You see Naver, hosted on ISP2 on ISP2 network. Again, because now ISPs have disincentives in hosting popular content, now they can demand more money from Naver, right? Because if they host Naver on their network, users on ISP1, ISP3, they'll get the data from Naver, which means ISP2 has to pay money to ISP1 and ISP3, right? So that increased. So it set up this incentive for ISPs to host popular content, which means that just increased the amount of internet access fees that content providers have to pay. I'm sharing something else here.
Professor Park, we'll come back to you.
Okay.
If you could just switch the
Sure,
slides.
I'll hold on to this. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Park. That was a great illustration of the challenges with the sender party network-based model. Actually, it's a great segue to Thomas. Thomas, I wanted to understand, how Netflix was impacted. We've seen a lot of confusion around the Telecommunications Business Act, Section 22(7), which was amended in 2020, and it says that platforms must ensure quality of service. Professor Park has illustrated how that was a response to, what happened with the SPNP model. How has this amendment been implemented so far, and how have you handled the quality of service requirements in the country as Netflix?
Yeah, thank you, Nikhil, and maybe just so before I go straight into the specifics of Korea, I just wanted to reinforce the point that what we are seeing at the moment is really a campaign by large telecommunications companies as opposed to a regulatory trend. I think Carl, Barbara, Professor Park have done a good job, kind of summarizing this global landscape. But we have seen a lot of noise and really arguments grounded in false premises by large telecommunications companies. But so far, I think regulators have been very, very cautious all around the world not to take those on face value, and for good reason. And so really, thank you again for organizing this platform so we can actually share the facts and help decision makers ground their thinking into the facts as opposed to the campaign. you're right. Netflix has been, I think, very much quoted regarding the events in Korea. And maybe just to kind of paraphrase Professor Park, 2016 is when center party pay rules came into force in the country. And what it did was really upset the natural balance for interconnection between various networks on the internet in Korea. Everywhere else in the world, those interconnections are freely negotiated between networks. And because ISPs sell to their customers the service of connecting to everybody else, there's a very, very strong alignment of interest to actually interconnect. And so you have over 70,000 networks on the internet. That's billions and billions and billions of interconnections. And so obviously when you have so many connections, including here in India through Extreme IX, Nixie, and all the various internet exchange points in the country, you cannot, there's no way to contractualize them and let alone regulate them because there's just too many. And so the reality is that the vast majority of those connections, they're just based on a handshake. I think 99.99% of those connections are just based on a handshake because they are so obviously mutually beneficial. They're not even worth the paper to write the contract on. And so flashback to Korea 2016, the center party pay rules upset this balance, introducing a settlement mechanism between ISPs. What this created is this situation where all of a sudden interconnection in Korea becomes a lot more expensive relative to interconnection outside of Korea. And so what the rule has done is create an incentive to interconnect outside of Korea. And so for many, many content providers, including Netflix, we ended up delivering content from outside the country, from Japan, from Hong Kong, from the US even, so that meaning that when users press play on Netflix, instead of having a local server from our Open Connect program deliver the content, they were streaming from far away. Now, the user experience on Netflix is not very latency sensitive, so we just went along with it. I think we were fine, but it's just so inefficient, right? Because that means you have to scale submarine capacity outside of the country to deliver the content, which is really, really not a great way to do things from an efficiency standpoint, and really not the way it's done anywhere else.
And does it also create a disincentive for Korean ISPs to even carry traffic then? Because they end up paying more if they are carrying more traffic.
So it would. We have not seen that behavior relative to Netflix traffic outside to Korea. So we have seen situations in other geographies where operators would throttle our traffic to force a payment. That's textbook net neutrality rules. I think in Korea it's a little bit more hidden in a way, because what it forces you is go outside of the country and face a latency hit. So for many services, latency is very important, not for Netflix. So we didn't see that degradation, to be perfectly honest with you. It did create an incentive to say, oh, well, hold on. If there's no payment, then we have to make the payments mandatory. And so I think what you're seeing is not only an upsetting of a system that works, but also a regulatory creep, because 4 years later, we have this service stability law. And now 3 years even later, so 7 years after sending party pays, you still have bills being proposed to try and fix something that anywhere else didn't need fixing in the first place. So it really shows you that these rules, they make the networks less efficient. They have to build cables at their own cost, which really makes no sense. It hurt the users because the users have lesser quality, higher latency. In fact, Korea has the highest latency of all the OECD countries for loading internet web page. And then it even creates administrative burden because you still have to add on laws to try and fix something because you're trying to fit a round peg in a square hole.
So, Alyssa, wanted to understand, how does the sending party network-based model work with CDNs and localized exchanges? How does it impact the way they function? And to that end, how does termination fee also impact that?
Yeah, so thank you for doing this panel again. I'm going to echo everyone else, and thank you for all the comments. I feel like a lot of the commentary has already been had, so it's wonderful in some ways to go last. So CDNs essentially do exactly what Professor Park's image showed. They cache content locally to make traffic more efficient. So if you think about that from a practical standpoint, what you can do is essentially cache lots of content locally for lots of different kinds of websites. So for Cloudflare, for example, we have millions of different customers. We have something like 20% of all global websites that sit on us. That makes traffic a lot more efficient if you can cache it locally. So all of the benefits that Thomas was talking about, so the benefits for consumers, so reduced latency, the benefits for ISPs, which is better sort of traffic efficiency. So thinking about how they actually get traffic, fewer hops. And then also the question of resiliency. So the idea of having more connections, the other thing that the sort of arrangement of having lots of local caches does is it makes sure there are lots of ways of getting that content. So if you think about what resiliency looks like, there are lots of places to get it from. So one of the amazing things about the internet model is that it's not just one path. So if one path goes down, you can go around it essentially because there are lots of different alternative paths. That incentive system that Thomas talked about changing in South Korea, when you have a sender party pays model, there are disincentives to have lots of hops and lots of paths because no one wants to pay for those individual interconnections. So you end up with fewer. I think from a CDN standpoint, one of the challenges, if you are serving lots of different content, again, you're making the internet more efficient and reducing latency, but it changes the model because you end up having to pay for your customers' content to get delivered from a practical standpoint, if that's what it looks like. One of the interesting things about Cloudflare is I said that we have something like 20% of all global websites on our service. We actually have a free service, so we can make traffic efficient for free for lots of different people. It benefits the ISP because the traffic again is fewer hops for consumers, or reduced latency, but also less strain on their networks because the content doesn't have to travel as far. So practically, it just sort of disrupts that arrangement, and you end up in a world where the same world that Thomas talked about. You end up with more latency for consumers because it's more hops to get there. You end up with more strain on the networks because content has to travel farther on more networks. So I think it has kind of the same challenges overall. But I think the interesting thing about CDNs is that they do it for lots of different kinds of traffic. And we in particular, the idea that we can do it for all sorts of internet traffic means there's just an overall benefit for content, for delivery of traffic.
So, Alyssa, you've got global context on this. So it almost seems like word games being played away here, right? So we've talked about the sender party network-based model. How is that different from paid peering? How is that different from termination fees? How is that different from network usage fees? And are all of these things the same, or are they different? And again, like you said, a large number of your customers are actually on the service for free. How does each of those impact your customers or your costs of delivering a service for free?
Sure. So one thing is sort of helpful to understand what the network looks like in general. I think what you see is exactly, I think, as someone else has said, most of traffic is exchanged on sort of handshake deals because it's mutually beneficial. And so what you see for a variety of different networks is just interconnection. So that's an internet exchange point. Sometimes it can be lots of different ways of just exchanging traffic. That is what's peering, right? So the idea that each party just connects together and you have exchanges, that is the sort of general basis for peering. There is something separate, which is asking for a large transit provider to actually carry your traffic somewhere. And typically that's a way of getting content to different places. So that is not necessarily the end. That is not the sort of connection to the end user necessarily. It's actually the almost the backbone around the world of how traffic ends up getting delivered. So if you are a smaller network and you want your traffic to get delivered somewhere, you can actually pay a large transit provider. Those are the sort of backbones around the world to deliver traffic to lots of different places. That's transit. The interesting thing about paid peering is the questions of how you interconnect tend to be market driven. So there are situations where you end up with a paid relationship because it's a business relationship, sort of market driven for interconnection. But again, those ideas are I think something like more than 99% of all connection points online are settlement free because it is mutually beneficial. So although there's certain cases where the market changes the dynamic somewhat, and their business reasons for it. For the vast majority of interconnection points, they are settlement free, which is essentially free, right?
So I'm sorry, could you just repeat that? For a vast majority, these interconnections are settlement free?
Correct. So I think when there was a study done a couple of years ago, and it was more than 99% of all internet connections are settlement free. So again, free peering, and we actually see that practically. I think that we are connected to, we have some of the most significant network connections in the world. We're connected to more than 12,000 networks globally, directly connected to more than 12,000 networks globally. I think that's, and I think a tiny fraction, significantly less than 1% have any sort of paid relationship, and that includes peering. That includes transit. So things that are sort of formally requiring, sort of asking for help in carrying traffic, that includes that. So practically, the vast majority of traffic is interconnected on a free basis, again, because it's mutually beneficial.
And just in terms of if there are network usage fees that are imposed in South Korea, then how does that impact the value chain on the other side?
Yeah. So one of the challenges, of course, is that it makes everything more expensive. So imagine you're a small business in South Korea and you want your traffic to get served to users in Korea. Well, it actually would help a lot potentially if you had maybe it would help you to have a CDN. Maybe you want to store it somewhere else, your content somewhere else. Maybe you want to be able to look for business reasons for lots of different sort of arrangements technically. What this under-party network pays system does is it disincentivizes the providers from caching the content locally because they have to pay for it. So it changes the way traffic gets delivered in ways that actually can have a pretty significant effect. So now you potentially end up with a latency charge. It's more expensive for you to get your traffic delivered because someone has to pay more money for you to get your traffic delivered. So you end up paying more just to have your small business essentially, right? And to have it delivered well online. And so you end up sort of changing where the cost goes. So for our free customers, for example, we can't afford to serve them locally inside Korea because they are not paying us anything. And if to the extent that it costs money to serve traffic inside Korea, we can't pay for them to have if they are not paying us. And so that raises challenges. It causes increased latency for them inside Korea. So practically, again, you end up with a less efficient traffic flow and more latency, which again doesn't make a lot of sense. There's not a lot of benefit to it from a practical standpoint.
Thomas, one of the things that the Indian telecom industry is saying is that the fair share charge represents a just compensation mechanism intended to be paid by the largest traffic generators to telecom service providers, driven by the goal of ensuring sustainability of telecom networks and create a harmonious and just framework that secures the industry's well-being over a long term. A fairer allocation of network costs can relieve the pressure on consumer prices for communication services as the only way to meet enormous investment needs of the sector And so what they're basically saying is charge the large traffic generators so that we don't have to charge consumers. What's wrong with that approach?
Yeah, you're right. I think this is the kind of the crux of that campaign we were focusing on, right? Operators will say, "Oh, there's so much traffic generated by those large platforms, and then it's creating those unsustainable costs. But I need the extra money from those platforms to keep investing." It's wrong, and wrong again. It's wrong once because Netflix doesn't generate traffic on the internet. It is the people who pay for their internet connection, consumers in India who pay their ISP to do whatever they want. When on an average night, people will watch Netflix because they want to watch their favorite TV show. They pay for an internet connection to be able to do just that. If there's a cricket game and the national team is playing, I can tell you, not many people will watch Netflix. So saying that Netflix generates the traffic, or is it the Indian national team that generates the traffic? The reality is that people generate the traffic. So it's wrong. So this campaign is wrong once. The second,
I'll come there.
Yeah.
They have a response to this. I'll come to that immediately after. But what about them saying that we'll have to increase cost for consumers if we are not able to charge, let's say, companies like Netflix?
Yeah, which is the other wrong argument, which is this notion that this growth of traffic somehow is unsustainable, and is creating a growth of cost. It is not. It is when you look at how a network is designed, the vast majority of the cost components, they are actually fixed relative to traffic. It's about digging the roads, to lay cables in the ground, to lay fiber cables on the ground. It's building masts to put antennas, in the air to connect people. All of those components, 90% of the cost, it has to be paid by or invested by the networks, regardless of the traffic. In fact, it's the other way around. More traffic, more demand for ISP services is more revenue for the ISPs. It's a good thing for the ISPs because it creates demand for a new service that they can sell. I was looking at the statistic from TRI that has done a great job looking at this market over the last decade for ISPs in India. And so I'll quote TRI, and over the last decade, data and traffic revenue has grown tenfold and is now 85% of revenues from operators. The subscriber base for internet access has grown 4 times and and the revenue has almost doubled, plus 86%. So what you're seeing is that the demand to watch cricket, to watch Netflix, is a tremendous opportunity that has been captured in large part by Indian networks, and we're in the same boat together. We partner with companies in India so that operators, for example, can resell Netflix. We partner on the network side with the caching. We are natural partners with operators, and we have those very, very mutually beneficial relationships. The imposition of a one-sided fee breaks that incentive, as we have seen with the Korean example. I do want to make one small comment also about the third way in which the campaign is wrong. It is this notion that somehow, if you gave an extra handout of revenue to telecom companies, they would start investing more. I think evidence has shown time and time again that it is actually competition that is driving investments. And operators, they invest when they compete. And so you have two sides of this investment criteria. You have competition, operators compete, and it's great. We compete, Netflix competes, we compete with Disney, we compete with streamers, we compete with Geo as well, which is also a streamer, and it's great. Competition drives investment, we invest in movies and TV shows, and it's fine. Operators compete on networks, they invest in their networks, and this is fine. Overall, though, the key point is that the demand is joint. It's the demand for services that drives the demand for the network and benefits everyone.
So the other point that they've argued is, and quick, I'll go to Carl and Barbara after this, is that they're saying that it is not, it is a flawed argument that OTTs do not generate traffic, but the end users' demand leads to traffic, because OTTs decide without user control and knowledge the traffic volumes that are delivered, as well as compression techniques, whether they're transmitting in standard definition, high definition, or ultra high definitions, and how to proceed in case of network congestion by reducing the quality of the streaming. So they're saying you're responsible for how much traffic because you can choose. And they're saying features such as autoplay, continuous play, or advertising are also not requested by end users, but automatically provisioned in these services. So they're saying that your argument that users generate traffic is flawed.
I think here we are going into an additional level of details. I think the principle is user press play, user watches, user decides, right? And this is always that's the choice. User choice is at the crux of streaming, right? You can choose whatever you want, whatever you watch, you press play and you watch it. Our experience, and we have tested this, is that it's not great for end users to, press play and then, oh, which resolution do you want? Which exact quality codec do you want to watch your content in? Now, that is not to say that Netflix will just carelessly throw random traffic on the network as soon as the user press play. Why? Because there again, we have a shared incentive with the ISP, which is that the stream works well. Nothing is worse than trying to watch your game or your movie and then it stops because there's not even bandwidth and you have a rebuffer. If that happens to anyone, they're angry at Netflix, they're angry at their ISP. So nobody wants this. And so what we do is we tailor the encoding of the video very, very carefully to offer the best possible quality with the lowest possible amount of data. Just to give a sense, every 5 years, in the past few years, we have divided by 2 our bitrate. So we invested a lot in video encoding. We wouldn't do that if we just didn't care, right? So obviously we care. We also will adapt. If the network is low performance, lower throughput, we will reduce the quality of the stream to make sure that it goes through. And we also adapt to the screen, right? If you're watching on a small screen, you'll get less pixel than if you're watching on a big screen. So we're being extremely careful on this, on the efficiency, because it's good for the consumers. As a consequence, it's good for Netflix. It's also good for the networks.
Thanks so much. Barbara, in India, we often hear that that around the world, last mile ISPs are paid to terminate traffic that their customers have requested. And Indian telecom operators are concerned that if they're not paid, they'll be unable to finance networks. Are there such agreements in place globally? And is this a valid fear for telecom operators that they won't be able to finance networks? And this is for Carl as well.
Yeah, thanks, Nikhil. And I just want to start by adding one thing to Thomas's answers to your earlier questions. The first is, that users, not only does Netflix and other content providers have an incentive to keep the data that is associated with their service efficient, they actually give users a lot more choice over how much data their services use than you would imagine. So, not only am I the person who clicks, I want to watch this video now, I want to play this game now, I have lots of controls in my settings over, do I even want to be able to watch video over my cell phone connection? And then, I can override the default settings that Thomas mentions that try to make life easier for our users and say, no, I really want you to use this low resolution of data all the time. Or so here are the policies I want you to follow. And so I think it's just plain wrong to say that users have no control over how much data their applications are using. So now you're asking, people are saying this is happening around the world. I want to echo what everyone else has said, which is, if you look at the interconnection markets around the world historically, And we are looking at the last mile ISPs, so the ones that provide broadband access to people around the world. Both historically and right now, the vast majority of these agreements between last mile ISPs and the people they interconnect with falls into two categories. Either the ISP pays for its own connection to the internet, which means they pay so-called transit providers to send their data to and from the internet. There clearly the last mile ISP is not paid. It pays someone else to connect them to the internet. That makes sense. And then the other kind of agreement that we see with last mile ISPs is that they interconnect with someone directly. Those were the agreements that Alyssa talked about quite a bit. And they exchange the data without a fee. That's settlement free. And for anybody who, and so that's the vast majority of peering agreements. So the idea that in general, broadband providers around the world are getting paid to deliver the traffic that their customers requested is just wrong. And, because both Alyssa and Thomas mentioned it, the report they were talking about was the report by the Packet Clearinghouse, which has done a worldwide study of interconnection agreements 2011, 2016, and 2021. And over, they have found that, when you look at peering agreements, the 2021 version said 99.998% of peering agreements are unpaid. That's the reality. And whenever you talk with people about what's happening in their country, that's what's happening there. So that's number one. These kinds of payments are the outlier. So the vast majority of internet service providers around the world are able to run their network and deploy better broadband infrastructure without receiving any fees. Two, they say, oh, but now we need to deliver more traffic and we can't pay for that unless we get these extra fees. That is not accurate. And, there I really want to remind everyone that it's often one thing what people say to the regulator, and it's one thing what they say to their investors when they cannot lie. And so Vodafone itself, in an investor presentation in 2021, said very clearly, yeah, traffic is increasing all the time, but the cost of delivering this traffic have become cheaper and cheaper. And basically they have fallen faster than the amount of traffic has increased. And so with that, they have made very clear, even though traffic increases, our costs have not increased. So there is no extra investment that somehow needs to be funded. Then finally, you mentioned, well, but people say some of the largest ISPs around the country are being paid for delivering the traffic that their customers requested, even though they are already being paid by their users to provide that service. That's the outlier. And the reason these companies are able to do that is because in most cases, they have found a way to blackmail the companies delivering data into paying them for terminating the traffic to their customers. We have seen that in the US, we are seeing that in Europe, we are seeing that in the Asian Pacific region. So how does that work? If I'm, let's say, Comcast in the US, which controls access to a huge part of the US broadband customers, or I'm Deutsche Telekom and I control access to almost 40% of fixed broadband customers in the United States, I have a number of customers that everybody has to serve. Even if I'm Google or Facebook or Netflix, I can't afford to forego access to Deutsche Telekom's customers, to Comcast customers. And that gives these very, very large providers, generally only the one largest provider in a country, specific power to force companies into paying them, even though they don't want to. The playbook for that is very simple. As we just saw, there are effectively only two kinds of connections into a network. One are the connections that I call unpaid. So either the last mile ISP pays the transit provider, so the last mile ISP doesn't receive a payment, or it exchanges data settlement free. These are unpaid connections. Or the last mile ISP gets paid by someone delivering data, that's the paid connection. So what's the playbook for making everyone pay you for delivering data? Well, you degrade the quality of the unpaid connections into your network. The most prominent example of that has been well documented was what happened from 2012 to 2015 in the United States. They're the 5 largest broadband providers in the country: Comcast, AT&T, Verizon, Time Warner Cable, and CenturyLink. They degraded the unpaid connections into the network by refusing to widen these doors into their network as traffic was growing every day. And as a result, without expanding the doors into the network, there was a huge amount of congestion at the unpaid doors into their networks. So if there is congestion, then your applications don't work anymore. It was really bad. Voice calls didn't go through, videos were stuttering, schools couldn't upload their payroll data. This was a big deal because if you were a Comcast customer, basically your internet access stopped working for many hours in the day, generally from 5 p.m. to midnight. And so then Comcast went out and said to Google and Facebook and Microsoft and Apple, said, hey, isn't that a pity that your stuff wouldn't work anymore? So if you're interested in good quality interconnection, please pay us a fee. And so these large companies said, yeah, we really can't afford to not reach Comcast subscribers, and they started paying. Whereas other companies, and Netflix originally was in that category, Cogent Level 3, so big transit providers that deliver the traffic of many small businesses and startups, Riot Games, which is the maker of World of Warcraft, they said, no, you are already being paid by your customers to transport their data to and from the rest of the internet. That's why they connect, that's why they pay you. And so we don't think it's right that we should pay you a second time. But because they didn't pay and all unpaid connections into the network were congested, that severely degraded the performance of the data that came into through these congested connections. So at some point in February 2014, Netflix gave up and said, we really need these subscribers on Comcast networks, and started paying Comcast. So, but for everyone else, this behavior went on until in 2015, the FCC adopted the second version of its net neutrality rules in the 2015 Open Internet Order. And that changed things because, I saw someone in the Q&A asked about what's the relation to net neutrality here. That changed things because these practices by Comcast and AT&T were only possible because there was a loophole in the 2010 net neutrality rules. So in the US, the net neutrality protections since 2010 have explicitly said a last mile ISP is not allowed to charge anybody who's delivering data to them, apps and services, for access to their customers. That's the termination fees or network usage fees we have talked about. They have been explicitly prohibited in the 2010 net neutrality protections. However, the 2010 net neutrality order also said that the net neutrality protections do not apply to the point where data enters the network. So they do not apply to interconnection agreements. And so even though these fees would have been prohibited if you charge them while the data travels across their network, there was nothing the FCC could do if these fees were imposed at the point where data enters their network. That was the huge loophole, and that makes no sense. from a consumer perspective and from an application and content provider, it's totally irrelevant whether a broadband provider blocks the website I want to watch or I want to access as the data packet is traveling across its network, or whether it blocks the website as it enters the network. But that had been the choice that the FCC had made in 2010. And as a result, even though this was front page news, more than 75% of all customers in the United States were on one of these 5 ISPs that use these practices to strong arm content providers and transit providers into paying them for access to their customers, there was nothing the FCC could do about it. So the 2015 Open Internet Order changed that. And in that order, the FCC said, we continue to say that network fees, termination fees violate our net neutrality protections. But then they added one critical piece. They said, you cannot circumvent our net neutrality protections at the point where data enters our network, at the point of interconnection. So that closed the loophole. We know these fees violate net neutrality, and suddenly it doesn't matter whether you charge them at the point of interconnection. And it's really ironic, but these 5 ISPs that had continued to congest, to let the connections, the unpaid connections into their network congest, they waited until the week before the Open Internet Order took effect. So, the order was adopted, and then it took a couple of months until it took effect. And the week before the order took effect, they all came to the table and entered into agreements. And only in one case, Cogent reports, did Cogent have to start the process of filing a complaint. Everyone else basically looked at the law and said, this is obvious. We don't want the regulator to create a precedent. We know we can't charge these fees under the net neutrality protections. We can't circumvent them through interconnection. So let's just start playing these games. And so, I tell these stories in this positive length to illustrate 2 things. One, this is the total outlier. Even in the US at the time, only the 5 largest ISPs could afford to engage in these practices. Nobody else was doing this. Right now in Europe, Deutsche Telekom in Germany is the only provider who can engage in this practice because it's large enough to do that. 2, these kinds of practices have huge collateral costs. You only motivate people to pay for access to your customers if all the unpaid connections into your network suck. And that hurts everyone who can't afford to pay. So what kind of system do we get? The large platforms, they don't want to pay, but they can afford to. But everyone else, the small businesses and startups, the Cloudflares of the world that host people on the free tier, they cannot afford to pay these higher fees. And so their traffic will come in through congested connections. And that's a huge problem because, your ability to use the internet should not depend on whether the website you want to visit can pay for access to you. And so basically, when a country has good net neutrality protections or an explicit ban on network fees or standing party network pays in the law, that forecloses the ability of these large ISPs to basically blackmail everyone into paying them if they can afford it. And, it prevents them from taking their customers hostage. But they are the outlier, and you don't want to go to that kind of system because it ultimately hurts everyone except from the largest ISPs that get additional profits. And I just want to flag, and maybe Carl wants to talk about that or someone else, but that it doesn't just distort competition between companies that can pay for interconnection and those that can't. It also distorts competition among ISPs because, the small ISPs are not large enough to pull off these practices. And so they don't get this kind of income. That's a good thing. Everyone should come back to the norm and provide unpaid interconnection, uncongested interconnection as part of your broadband internet access service.
Thanks, Barbara. Carl, I'm not sure if Barbara has left anything to be said, but in case you want to jump in. Secondly, there is one interesting thing that's popped up in India, which is that there is many countries have there's a universal services obligation fund where telecom operators charge a part of the fees to consumers and then they contribute that money to rolling out network infrastructure. They're saying that online service providers should also independently be charged a percentage of their revenue to a broadband fund or a universal services obligation fund. Have we seen anything of this sort anywhere else in the world?
Yeah, thank you. So let me kind of start where Barbara left off and talk a little bit about the kind of the implications of these type of rules, how it affects also competition among ISPs, because I think that's an important thing to flag. Just before going in that, I really want to reiterate what a lot of people have mentioned in terms of what the norms are in terms of interconnection, and that settlement-free peering really is the norm. And I highly recommend people to look at this study by Packet Clearinghouse. And I think Barbara mentioned this. It's not even like, it's not 99%, it's 99.9. Like it's a very, very high number in there. So it's good to just get a sense.
I also want to flag that we might end up going a little bit over time today. I hope that's okay with everyone. Although I'm sure Barbara must need to go to sleep soon. But sorry, Carl.
Yeah, no worries. No, I think that's important just to kind of recap back to what Thomas was saying, that the sending party pays rules that you had in South Korea, it wasn't just that it was a little bit of a tweak to an existing relationship. It was really disrupting an ecosystem, because the ecosystem had a norm about settlement-free peering, and then suddenly the government comes in and mandate this accounting model of sending party pay. So it's not just a little tweak here, it's really a disruptive thing to the ecosystem, and that's why you see the impacts that Professor Park described and that others have described. But to kind of build on Barbara's point around the impact here on ISPs, and this connects back to this discussion around termination fees. So it might be useful to just kind of quickly recap this idea of termination fees and termination access monopoly, because basically what it means is that the access provider can act as a gatekeeper vis-a-vis third parties to access its customers, right? So if a third party wants to interact with your customers, then the access provider can sort of be a gatekeeper, and the third party doesn't really have any choice but to deal with that access provider. So structurally, this access provider kind of becomes this bottleneck in the last mile that they can exploit in order to charge third parties. So this is precisely, to Barbara's point, why net neutrality rules are so valuable, because it prevents the access provider from exploiting this sort of structural condition, right? So what Barrick mentions, and I highly recommend people also to read Barrick's analysis of these proposals in Europe, because people mention that, but the trend in Europe, or the sentiment in Europe, it is a highly negative sentiment towards these rules. And I think Barrick has taken a really good analysis in looking through in detail what this would mean.
What's the number in terms of how many countries actually support and how many countries oppose?
There hasn't been a formal vote on this in that respect, but I know that there's been the sort of informal reporting from the discussions that we've seen is something around, I think 20 countries that have explicitly been against this. I know there's a lot of countries that kind of been on the fence, but I haven't heard any country that have at least formally gone out and said that they're supporting this. But I have seen countries that have explicitly come out and said that they're concerned about this. So it's hard to tell exactly what the balance is, but it's definitely a majority at this point that are highly skeptical of this, if not, outright rejecting this idea. And if people haven't seen it, I think it was the Italian undersecretary, I think, sent a letter to Commissioner Breton expressing Italy's concerns about this. And it's a very well-articulated letter that kind of hits all the points that you've heard today about why this is such a bad idea and why the very premise of this is flawed. But what BEREC, so the body of European regulators, what they've talked about in relation to this termination monopoly and these rules that are being proposed is basically that it would reinforce the power of the termination monopoly. So why? Well, basically because you would become required to negotiate with the access provider for them to deliver your traffic. And because they have this termination monopoly, they would be able to exploit it to charge very high prices to the third party. So this is why BEREC says that, well, these types of rules, rather than net neutrality trying to sort of limit the risk of someone exploiting this termination monopoly, what these rules would do is basically give them a carte blanche to exploit it, right? So it works in direct conflict with the idea of net neutrality. And what they also describe, and this gets to the competition concerns between different sizes of ISPs, is that a termination monopoly, basically, it's a function of your number of users. So if you have a lot of users, as Barbara described, then you have a very strong termination monopoly power, so to speak. You have a strong bargaining power that you can exploit. If you're a small network, you don't really have this power. So what this means is that while a large ISP might be able to negotiate these high fees with a content provider, say, a small ISP might not be able to do that, both because of the transaction costs involved, that the content provider might not find it beneficial to, sit down and write a contract with someone who has a user base of 10,000 people versus, 10 million. So both in terms of the transaction cost of actually contracting, but also in terms of the fees that could be charged, that could fall very differently between the sizes of ISPs. But interesting, it could also have this very perverse effect where a small ISP that is not able to negotiate this contract with a content provider, they might become dependent on the large ISP to actually retrieve that traffic. And that means that the large ISP can kind of double dip here. They can charge both the content provider for receiving that traffic, and they can also charge the small ISP for sending that traffic forward to the small ISP. So this, of course, distorts the competition in the ISP market as well. So the only real beneficiaries of these rules are the large telecom operators. And this is kind of reflected in a debate in Europe as well.
What about the USO fund?
Largest one. Sorry?
What about the USO fund? The
Universal Service Fund. So the principle around the Universal Service Fund is that you have this kind of cross-subsidization within the industry. So if set of telecom operators or network operators is not financing deployment in one part of the country, then you're basically all contributing to a pot to make it more profitable to make those investments. But in this case, the content providers are not in the business of providing access services or that telecom infrastructure for users. So it doesn't really make any sense for them to have contributed to this pot, in my view. And you would still have this kind of perverse effect that you would have in a sending party pays regime, because you would need to, account for their contribution to this universal service fund on these traffic volumes. As Thomas have described, it doesn't really make sense to make that accounting on traffic volumes. So you would in effect have a sending party pays regime. It's just that you wouldn't send it to the telecom provider directly. It would go to a universal access fund. So it's more like what path does the money flow? Does it go straight to the telecom operator, or does it go via universal access fund? But in terms of distorting the ecosystem, it would have a very similar effect, because you would still be charging volumes of data towards something, which doesn't make sense. And I kind of really want to hone in on this point.
So in India, it's not about volumes of data. Mm-hmm. They're saying that 3% of Indian net revenue should go to the fund.
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to speak to the Indian case or exactly what they're proposing here, but universal access funds is a common practice in many parts of the world, and it's precisely for this purpose that I described, that you want to be able to find profitability in expanding infrastructure in underserved areas, and you do that by the industry itself, the ones that are involved in providing access, actually all contributing to this fund. So in Europe, it would be the large telecom operators contributing to this, that they can then draw from that and make the investments. But I don't see why it would make any sense to have the content providers contribute to that fund, to be frank.
Alyssa, one of the arguments that we're seeing in favor of network usage fees is that it's a fair mechanism to rein in big tech. Have you heard this argument in other parts of the world, and what's your take on this?
Yeah, I think it's actually incredibly misguided in many ways. I have heard that argument before, and I think I think in many ways it comes from the fact that everybody wants to rein in big tech. So again, going back to that campaign concept, that's a very there's this sort of appealingness of that argument. I think one of the challenges, and this is the South Korea example, is that anything that you do that disrupts the ecosystem affects everybody. So in fact, actually, one of the big challenges, I think, with a lot of the network usage fee debate is that it does exactly what I think both Barbara and Carl have talked about, which is that it actually creates a system where big tech is in better shape than everyone else, because you end up in a world where if they pay for access for one reason or another, chances are they are going to be the ones who get that direct connection. So they end up prioritized. You end up almost in a system of paid prioritization for big tech, where the one set of entities that actually has the best service are the entities that you're now trying to punish. And so you've created a world where rather than actually helping the smaller businesses make sure that they have good access, make sure that the systems work well, so that new entrants can come on board, you've actually created essentially fast lanes for big tech, which is exactly what you didn't want to do in the first place. So I think that it's actually backward in many ways. I think people use that argument because it sounds appealing, but if you think about the effect on the ecosystem overall, practically, what you want is an ecosystem where a new entrant can come on board, consumers can get access to that content as appropriate, and then you have that competition piece that Carl was talking about on the content side as well. And so, how do you actually develop an ecosystem where that works? It's actually not a network usage fee world. It's a world where you have fast interconnections, where the expectation is that content will be delivered when people request it, where that is sort of an easy way of going about it. So again, I think that was a little bit backwards.
I'm just going to bring Professor Park in. There's and just to close it out, and we'll just move to questions that we have from those attending. Professor Park, one of the things that has changed in the last few weeks is that there is a settlement that's been reached between Netflix and SK Telecom. So, what's the general perception now of the Telecommunication Business Act now that this issue has been resolved? Like, what do tech policy professionals in the region think about the dispute settlement?
Well, the terms of a settlement are a secret, so we don't have a lot of information. But one thing that we know is that SK Telecom agreed to receive the data from Netflix within Korea on their network. So far, they have received it from. They set the hands-off point in Tokyo and Hong Kong, but now with this settlement, now they're going to receive it directly. Now, this is something that Netflix, offered to do for a long time. It was SKT has refused to connect within Seoul. So, and by refusing to connect, refused to receive the Netflix data in Korea, they had to spend extra money basically irrigating the data from Hong Kong and Tokyo to Seoul, and that cost in millions of dollars every year. So they already had a financial incentive to go along with what all other local ISP have been doing, which is basically settlement-free peering with cache servers of Netflix.
And is there any appetite for removal of the SPNP mechanism, given that it's caused so much distortion?
I do not. I think the government does now know. I mean, the government didn't know that they are the only government in the world doing this when they did it back in 2016. Why did they do it? I think they was persuaded by this argument by the telcos that, hey, look at the mobile data. You pay for throughput. You pay for volume of data, right? So we should somehow replicate that for the whole internet. What they didn't know is that volume charge is really for use of the proprietary network of access points of each telcos. It was not really the internet access fees. So as long as that argument is still there, I think the government will continue, and the government has actually listened to the argument about the harms of SPNP. So they try to kind of remove the harms of SPNP by saying, the sender pay will kick in only if the imbalance between send data and receive data is above certain threshold. But it's the right step, but not a sufficient step in the direction, because that still leaves in the incentive not to host popular content providers. I mean, what happened was because of that disincentive, the internet access fees for content providers in Korea increased to a level where it's like 8 times Paris, 10 times Frankfurt, and imagine the content providers paying like 10% of their revenue to internet access fees. How can we have a viable, startup economy in a situation like that? And then that high internet access fees paid by domestic content providers are now being used as a reason to charge overseas content providers when they were peering settlement free with the ISPs, with the Korean ISPs before. So because of this really distorted argument, I don't know what will happen in the future, but I know that the government does understand the harms of SPNP. Maybe if okay, I have a good answer to that. I think will be what will really have a big impact is what Europe decides to do. If Europe decides not to adopt the sender pay model, I think Korea will backtrack on even the limited sender pay, the limited only to ISPs, right? A limited sender pay model, because we will now have a good argument that this is not a direction that the world is going.
Understood. I think Toma wants to come in on this since we're talking about the settlement. Toma, you want to tell us what the settlement was?
Okay, I'll tell you what it is not. It is not an endorsement of sender party pays. And so really to the point of, clarifying like what's what and any kind of misconception that may have communicated, it is not that. Of course, agreements between companies are confidential, so I cannot reveal any detail. I said before, there's common incentives between content providers and ISPs, because at the end of the day, the great content is what stimulates the demand for the connectivity, for internet connectivity. So there's a natural fit. I think in this case, both Netflix and SK were just happy to move on, settle the dispute, and focus on the consumers, which want to have access to great content, fast speeds, efficient networks. So that's what the settlement is about.
Okay. Do you want to respond to any of the other points that Professor Park was saying?
No, just wanted to give that clarification. I think the point.
Got it. So in case anyone has any questions, please let us know. I think a couple of questions have been answered. Particularly, Barbara, if you want to just get into this, the question that Deepak Maheshwari has raised about, there are payments demanded by, let's say, an ISP that's not in India, for example, a US-based ISP to an ISP in India that is receiving the traffic. The Indian ISP basically bears the cost of the connection all the way to the US, but also pays port charges to the ISP as in the US. I don't know if Mr. Maheshwari is here, but would you have a response to his point?
Yeah, so I mean, I did want to ask because I wasn't sure what exactly the question was, whether this is about an Indian last mile ISP paying a transit provider like Cogent or Level 3 to be connected to the internet. This has nothing to do with net neutrality. This has nothing to do with the network usage fee debate. If you don't have your own connection to networks worldwide, yeah, you need to pay someone, your transit provider, for access to the internet. So that's not controversial, I would say. So then I'm wondering, the other possibility that this question could be about, that it was about Indian ISPs delivering data to last mile ISPs in the US. And so I think it would be helpful to just get a quick clarification.
He's not on the call anymore, but Mr. TV Ramachandran had either a point or a question.
Okay.
Mr. Ramachandran?
So then I do have an answer to that. If we are talking about this question of who pays for the long distance data transport. So I think the problem we are all trying to zero in on, and that is triggered by the network usage fee debate, is the problem of last mile ISPs exploiting their termination monopoly over access to their customers. As everyone has explained, if someone wants to get to me, they have to go through my internet service provider. For me, that's Comcast. There is no way around Comcast. And, when in these situations where the largest last mile ISPs have charged termination fees, we have seen that they absolutely exploit this termination monopoly. They don't just charge fees, they charge incredibly high fees. I was saying in my written answer to one of the questions, Level 3 always said the US ISPs wanted more from us for delivering data to their little corner of the internet, their own, Comcast internet access service. Then we charge people to connect our customers, to connect them to the entire internet. And we have seen that same kind of problem in Europe. So for example, there is a big WIC study on the state of interconnection in Europe, 2019 study, and that showed that the prices that Deutsche Telekom is charging are multiples of the market price. WIC says 3 to 5 times the market price for delivering traffic to Deutsche Telekom. Conversations with industry participants suggest that by now it's as much as 20 times as much than the transit price. So if you pay Deutsche Telekom directly for delivering traffic to its customers, you pay 20 times more. Some providers pay 20 times more than if they were just paying a transit provider. So that's the piece we are trying to zero in on. Both when net neutrality says, you can't charge companies for access to your providers. So in the US, everyone else has always said, we are happy to deliver the traffic close to the ultimate customer. So the buzzword we often use for that is, as long as it's reasonably localized. So, the Cloudflares and others of the world and other CDNs and, the large application and content providers, they don't want to drop off their traffic to Indian customers in New York and make Indian ISPs transport it across the ocean to India. No, they are happy to get the traffic to India. And I mean, and I don't want to speak to them, but that's generally how things work. You know, they get the content close to the ultimate customer, to a place in India, to a place in Germany, you know, close to me in Palo Alto. And then they hand it off to the last mile ISP close to the customer. And that's, so the question of who pays for this final step of the way, that's what we are talking about. You know, we are not talking about the content providers requesting anyone for paying to get the data from the US to India. And that's really critical, because once you say you cannot charge for transporting the data as a last mile ISP, you cannot charge for transporting the data from a reasonably localized point to your ultimate customer, then that still allows competition for this long distance transport to exist. So if I have a choice as a content provider or as a transit provider to hand it off to the last mile ISP relatively close to the customer, then I can choose among all sorts of players to get the traffic close there. You know, I can use one of the many CDN services if my content can be hosted on a CDN. I can use one of the many transit providers if that works for me. And I could use the last mile ISP if that service provider has the kind of transit service to transport my data from, let's say, New York to New Delhi, if that was what I wanted. But for that segment of the road or the path to the ultimate end users, there is lots of competition. There, the last mile ISP cannot exploit its termination monopoly. But what I cannot charge for is the final part of the way, you know, where the only one who can ultimately get the data to their internet service customers, the final step, that's the ISP. And if you want to see an example of that kind of model in action, the US Federal Communications Commission, you know, our telecom regulator, they adopted conditions on the Charter Time Warner merger that implemented exactly this regime, where they said, you know, we have seen all these problems in interconnection. We have seen the largest ISPs exploit their termination monopoly. And you know, that has hurt consumers because it was associated with letting all the unpaid connections congest. And to prevent that, we are adopting these merger conditions that say Charter cannot charge for interconnection, you know, as long as it's a reasonable amount of traffic, if the other side delivers the data reasonably close to the customer, and then Charter has to provide uncongested interconnection. And that has worked really well, and that would prevent, you know, an unfair allocation of costs.
I'm just going to bring in, we are bang out of time, but I'm just going to bring in TV Ramachandran for some comments he wanted to make. TV, you have your hand up. If you could unmute.
I'm not TV Ramachandran. Basically, I am very sorry. TV Ramachandran had some work, and
Okay.
because of that, I am Atul Jain. I'm Director Technology Standards in BIF. So,
Okay. So please, you had a comment to make. Please go ahead.
Yeah, basically, we have been arguing with the TRAI as well as with the DOT that OTT players should charge their fair share from the telcos, because in India from year 2019 to 2023, there has been increase of 248% in the data revenue, and that in the COVID period. Had that revenue not been there, the telcos would have been real deep trouble. So my question is, why OTTs across the world are not demanding fair share from telcos to counter their demand for fair share or network justice?
I guess that's a rhetorical question, but and the question also came up in the comments. But I guess we'll end at that. Thomas, you still have your hand up. You wanted to say something? Do you want a fair share from telecom operators?
Yeah, I'm worried about the press clippings if I say I do. No, but I think it's a very fair question to ask. And I think the beauty of a net neutrality regime is that each company can invest in what they do best. So for us, we compete in the streaming space. We invest in movies and TV shows for our members. Operators compete on networks and they invest on networks. And it works better this way. There is actually an example of a world in which content providers charge distributors for access to the content. It's called cable. It's cable TV.
In India, it happens the other way around, by the way.
And it works both ways because you have distribution fees and you have carriage fees, and then distribution fees or access to the content. So you have both, and sometimes they balance out. Sometimes one is bigger, sometimes the other is not. The point is, if you're a consumer, you depend on those backroom deals between the content providers and the network distributors, and you don't have control. Whereas on the net neutrality regime, you pay for your internet connection once, and you can do whatever you want. You can subscribe to any streaming service you like. So you get better consumer choice and better allocation of resources because companies invest better. So we think that's the superior model. If we ended up in a cable regime, who would pay whom? Indeed, is a fair question to ask.
So thank you, Tom. I think that's a great note to end on. I'm sorry, Debashish, we've run out of time, but more choice for more consumers, I guess, is the best thing that can happen. Thank you, Barbara, Thomas, Carl, Professor Park, Alyssa, for joining us, and especially thank you to Barbara for staying up so late at night to do this. This is a battle that is global. This is an issue that is global. So thank you all for bringing your perspective to India. I'd also like to thank ADIF, Meta, Google, and Netflix for supporting this discussion. This video will be up on YouTube. In case you'd like to share it with anyone, we'll also be writing about this on MediaNama, and we'll also share the transcript and the main points made with the regulator. Thank you for joining us.